Resident Evil 9 got announced for Switch 2. Now, this is the first time in 20 years, not since Resident Evil 4 on the GameCube, that Nintendo fans get a current-gen Resident Evil at launch. This is the story of how Hiroshi Yamauchi, a ruthless businessman, sunk his claws into the Resident Evil franchise for Nintendo. Hiroshi Yamauchi was the president of Nintendo in Japan from 1949 to 2002. From the time that man was in his 20s till he was in his 70s, he ruled Nintendo with an iron fist. The man made fortunes, lost fortunes, remade fortunes again, and dared anyone to challenge his superiority, which Sony did in the 90s with the PlayStation. Now, Hiroshi Yamauchi did not play video games. He was strictly a businessman. And so when his ego was wounded, the man struck back. Right away, Sony and the PlayStation started to gobble up Nintendo's empire. And he was not happy about this. So now it's the late 90s and the Sony PlayStation is thriving and the Nintendo 64 console is struggling in Japan. There's a famous story about Hiroshi Yamauchi going to visit his grandchildren and sees that there is a Sony PlayStation in their home. And the man infamously loses his mind. And he wants to know why. Why is this in your home? He said, "Sit down, Grandpa. We're going to show you why." And they showed him Resident Evil. And this infuriated and intrigued the man on many levels from a business standpoint, because he stormed back to the offices the next day and said, Why haven't we done this? And the general consensus was, we're a bit more family-oriented. We didn't think you'd want something like that. And the thing is, it's by Capcom, someone they've worked closely with throughout all of Famicom and Super Famicom years. So Hiroshi Yamauchi hatches a plan. The thing that made his grandchildren want a PlayStation should never be a thing for Sony again. So what he does is he says, I'm going to make them forget that this Sony PlayStation version even exists. So he locks up the rights to Resident Evil, the remake, because in the late 90s, video games were still a relatively young medium, and remakes were not common or even really a thing at all. So when they had that full-blown remake of Resident Evil 1 on the GameCube, the graphics were absolutely insane, and it was a real looker at the time. Now, there is an irony that original PlayStation version of Resident Evil 1 did show up on a Nintendo console a few years later as Resident Evil Deadly Silence for the original Nintendo DS. And the purists might say, well, yeah, but it's still technically a different version of it because you have touchscreen where you could do the stabby with the zombies on the thing with the stylus, which was pretty cool at the time. I mean, if you notice, the GameCube launched with Luigi's Mansion, Resident Evil. They turned Zero into a GameCube exclusive so that the story starts with Nintendo. And then the big one was Resident Evil 4 not going to PlayStation or PlayStation 2, but the GameCube. And it's the one time that Nintendo invested in power because, maybe subconsciously was trying to impress those grandchildren. Like, don't ever tell me I don't have something kick-ass. So then you also look at the fact that Resident Evil 2 was rushed out onto the Nintendo 64. A very good port, I might say. It's pretty impressive what they compressed into a cartridge. And then you got 2, 3 Nemesis, and Code Veronica all ported to the GameCube. So it really locked up that entire Resident Evil series onto Nintendo for a while. Unfortunately, the exclusivity for 4 didn't last because less than a year later it got ported to PS2 because you got to make money on things. And the user base on the GameCube it was just nowhere near what PlayStation 2 had. And so it's just seeing 7, 8, and 9 appear on the same day on Switch 2 is something that Nintendo fans and the ghost of Yamauchi should be extraordinarily pleased with.